do that introduction. I'm David Reed from First United Methodist Church and a member of the board, and we are just delighted that you're here at FUMC for a program tonight. This is our penultimate program of the year. Believe it or not, we're already there, almost finished. A couple of just easy things. Feel free to go to the back and get some coffee, get some cookies, anytime you want to. There are restrooms out and to your left is the big restrooms and a little restroom in the back. Every direction except towards Stover Street. You will find restrooms and they're unavoidable. Okay. And I'm going to let Mary Ann Bayer, who's another member of our board, do the introduction of our speaker this evening. Oh, I would like to say one more thing. Thank you for your contributions tonight. First United Methodist Church does not support this program directly. There's some staff time involved, and that's me. But we really do depend as an organization on your donations to keep Theologian Residence running smoothly, and to bring people like Jeannine all the way from New York to Colorado is an expensive proposition. We're going to find out it's well worth it tonight. Okay, Mary Ann.
Thank you, David. And again, welcome, especially to any newcomers who have joined us for the evening. We're delighted to have you with us. And we hope that this is indeed going to be an evening very well worth your time. Many of you know that this year in the Theologian in Residence program is the second year of our focus on the conversation, the dialogue between theology and the sciences. And so we've taken a look at theology, religion, faith, and how it has dialogued with the biological sciences and also with the physical sciences. So our conversations these past 2 years have focused on that. Tonight, we're going to be moving into new territory and taking a look at how theology converses, dialogues with the social sciences. The social sciences, of course, have much to say about their particular field, and so our speaker tonight will be taking a look at the conversation that may or may not be happening between both the social sciences, the theological sciences, the field of religious studies. It may or may not be happening, and so tonight we'll pursue possibilities for conversation. Tonight's presentation is the first part of a two-part series. On April 20th, we will be having a panel conversation in which we attempt to answer the question, does the conversation happen in Fort Collins? Could it happen in Fort Collins in regard to some of the issues that we face as a community? And we'd like to have your feedback in the process. Can wisdom traditions and the social sciences speak to each other for the future of Fort Collins? Our speaker tonight, as you all know, is Jeannine Fletcher. Jeannine hails from Big Apple, but she has had roots in the Midwest, having done her undergraduate work at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She received her Ph.D. in divinity at Harvard. She now teaches on the faculty at Fordham University. She is a systemic theologian specializing in issues of diversity, religious diversity, cultural diversity, race and gender issues. She also is director of the Service Learning Program for the students at Fordham, and also works within her own community in the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition on projects of social change. Jeannine has a book that will be forthcoming that will summarize her conversation with us tonight, entitled The Sin of White Supremacy, and we'll talk more about that later. So I welcome Jeannine warmly to Fort Collins. Thank you for taking the long journey to get here, and we're glad we have good weather to share with you tonight.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you to all the organizers of the Theologian in Residence program. So I was here probably 4 years ago or so, and my experience with this group has stayed with me, and I've been looking forward to having our conversation tonight. So I thank you all for being part of this. As Mary Ann has already shared, my particular project relies on an encounter with the social sciences. So I'm trained as a Christian theologian, and as I'm talking about wisdom traditions, I am going to foreground the tradition that I know the best. But the pattern that I'm suggesting is the same. That is, that our wisdom traditions offer us a vision of what it means to be human. They offer us a vision of the best of who we can be, and that the social sciences help us to ask the question, how are we doing, right? And how do we move ourselves closer to that vision? So I'll begin with some of the characteristics of a Christian social vision. And to do that, I'm going to draw on a few different time periods in thinking about, well, what's the social vision that Christianity puts forth? And I found it very compelling to go back to the Acts of the Apostles. And I have just, there's a lot going on here, but I'll draw out some of the key ideas here. In the Acts of the Apostles, which is the story of the early community, it's the continuation of the story of the Gospel according to Luke. So the story of Luke is Jesus' life and his ministry and his death and resurrection, and Acts is the community following Jesus in its early formation. And one of the things that we see in the in the Acts of the Apostles is this vision of the Christian community constituted in a particular way. So I have from chapter 2 this idea that the Christian community looked a particular way. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to breaking of bread and prayers. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Right? This vision of sharing life together and sharing possessions in common was important to this group of folks, these early Christians who wrote this gospel, because it's repeated again in the 4th chapter of Acts. In this section here, right, now the whole group of believers were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. There was not a needy person among them. And so this vision, this ideal vision of what it means to be human, what it means to be Christian, what it means to be a community, right? They held up this vision of who they wanted to be. The social sciences can help us to ask whether the idea in Acts that we see here of holding all things in common, whether that offers a description of a socio-economic historical reality in first century Palestine, or whether it might be an idealized literary construction that echoes the portrayals of friendship that were circulating in the ancient Greco-Roman writings. Right? So the Pythagoras has a proverb, which is, all things are common among friends. Right? So as this early Christian community was writing their own story, right, were they simply embedding what was circulating at the time in their vision, or does this actually reflect a historical reality where this community did hold all things in common? Whether the social scientific approach to the biblical text, right now it's kind of a debate in the field, right? And they're using new tools to ask this question. But whether we find that it's a historical reality or a literary fiction, this portrait had the potential in the first century, as it still does for us today, to shape the moral imagination of those who would read it or hear this story. Right? So that we don't have to finally decide, okay, was this actually historical or is this the point in thinking with the wisdom traditions is that they shape our moral imagination of who we are and who we want to be. As biblical scholar and pastor Gary Carver reads this passage, it provides a glimpse of an early Christian community who realized their own vulnerability and the need to share. An ordinary, common group of people had an extraordinary experience of being bound together in their witness to Jesus and being enlivened by his life. In Carver's words, these ancient Christians who wrote this story, right, they asked themselves simply, is this the best that we and God can do together? So this is a foundational wisdom from the ancient Christians, and the wisdom is that we can craft ourselves as a community where needs are met by holding possessions in common and sharing what we have with others. In the mid-20th century, the Catholic bishops at Vatican II asked a similar question. Looking at the world in which they lived, they asked the question also, is this the best that we and God can do together? When the bishops looked out on the world at Vatican II in the mid-20th century, and they imagined what it was to be God's people in the modern world, the bishops necessarily had a critique of the reality they saw in front of them. Poverty, injustice, the abuse of human rights. As they chose to speak to their moment, we can imagine the bishops drawing from this ancient wisdom, and perhaps even drawing the ancient wisdom of what does it look like to hold all things in common. And as they wrote forward their vision of what it means to be Christian, what it means to be God's people in their world, right, they looked out on the world and they had this to say. They said there must be made available to all persons everything necessary for leading a life truly human, such as food, clothing, and shelter, the right to found a family, the right to education, to employment, to a good reputation, to respect, to protection of privacy, and to rightful freedom in matters religious too. So this is a social vision. It's an element of Catholic social teaching, which is the place in which the Catholic Church kind of writes forward its vision of what it means to be human, right? And then we aim toward becoming that as people in the world. We have two visions in front of us, both rooted in the same witness to the wisdom of Jesus and the God whom Jesus reveals. And the wisdom is this, that God intends the flourishing of all, and that Christians enact that flourishing through communities that meet human needs by sharing all things in common. The wisdom of the Christian tradition holds that there is a singular source of all reality, which Christians name God, and that this God creates humanity and all the earth with the intention of flourishing for all. And so this is the background theory or the background theology that grounds both of these visions, that God created the world in a certain way. God created humanity with a desire and an intention that all would flourish. Christian care for the needs of human beings mirrors what Christians see as God's care for creation. In the words of Laudato Si from the current Pope Francis, we are called to be instruments of God, so that our planet might be what God desired when God created it, and so that our planet might correspond with God's plan for peace, beauty, and fullness. Thinking with the biological sciences, Christian theology sees an intricate design of the created world and sees in that intricate design God's care for humanity in the world. And so the call to care for other human beings is aligned with God's care for creation and God's care for humanity. So the Christian wisdom is that God has created the world and human beings within it, and humans are called to participate in God's care. The biological sciences helps us to see the intricate reality of God's care for creation. Theologian Wesley Wildman writes on one particular dimension of God's care for creation reflected in God's care for humanity. He writes at the intersection of religion and the biological sciences and invites us to consider not only the splendor of the delicate balance in our earthly environment, but the delicate balance of humanity within that environment. Contemplating and marveling at our embodied sacramentality, Wildman allows us to see the traces of God's care written on our skin. Our skin, he describes, evolved over thousands of years to create a living diversity adapted to diverse climates of the globe. As embodied human beings, our skin is just the right pigment to regulate temperature in differing encounters with the sun, while also enabling human beings to absorb the necessary amounts of vitamin D required for the functioning of our internal organs and the strengthening of our bones. The diverse climates of our environment required the evolution of diverse skin pigment as embodied human beings embedded in a complex ecosystem. And Wildman invites us to see that as part of God's care for creation and part of God's care for humanity. The diverse coloration of humanity reflects the complex adaptive systems of humans intimately entangled in the complex dynamic of earth and sun. Our chromatic diversity is just one piece of evidence that the Creator cares for the flourishing of all flesh. While biology can tell us that chromatic diversity is a necessity, History can tell us that Christians constructed this diversity not as a gift, but as a curse. As we attempt to craft the world our wisdom imagines, in a community that holds all things in common and strives toward the flourishing of all, we need to recognize that the place we're starting from today has failed in its flourishing because of racist social practices. In order to pursue the ancient and recent Christian visions of flourishing in the 21st century, we need to undo some of what we've done in the modern period with the terrible legacy of racism. So we need to add to the first century vision of being in community and the 20th century vision of meeting the needs of all within society a third essential component of Christian wisdom. That is, it must include racial justice. Here the words of Catholic theologian Brian Massingale are important as he names racial reconciliation as a divine gift and promise, partially realized here on earth and of certain fulfillment in a time known only to God. If Christians today desire a world where all humans flourish, they cannot ignore the great compromise to human flourishing that racism has been. Finally, in our day, in a globalized world where people of all places are in dynamic flow and movement, sharing our lives and our communities across multiple lines of difference means that human flourishing will require also cooperation and appreciation across religious difference. In the words of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, Christians are invited by the Spirit to encourage all religious institutions and movements to meet, to enter into collaboration, and to purify themselves in order to promote truth and life, holiness, justice, love, and peace, dimensions of that kingdom which at the end of time Christ will hand over to his Father. Thus, interreligious dialogue is truly part of the dialogue of salvation initiated by God. The ideas I've just presented give us 4 components of what I'm proposing a Christian wisdom imagines in our day. A vision that is one that is living in community, where everyone's needs are met, where racial diversity is a sacramental sign and interreligious cooperation is a value. Right? So these are the 4 components that I would say are part of a Christian wisdom for today. If this is the vision, how might we make it a reality? Yes. In his book, Doing Christian Ethics from the Margins, Christian ethicist Miguel de la Torre presents a framework for us to consider the meeting of the social sciences and the wisdom of the Christian faith. As we craft the world our wisdom imagine, we're invited into this praxis circle, and our wisdom kind of centers here. This is where de la Torre places it. Right? He says we're going to engage in ethical reflection, we're going to see the values from within our religious traditions, right? And we're going to try to move ourselves through action, right, to the embodiment of those values. The wisdom teachings of our faith traditions articulate values that might be the basis for action. Through reflection and action together, human beings make choices about who they want to be, how they want to live, and how they seek to organize their societies. In short, through reflection and action, human beings have the possibility to craft worlds. Yet de la Torre suggests that before we can engage in ethical reflection, imaginative planning, and creative action, we need to observe carefully the place from which we are beginning, and we need to ask some critical questions of analysis. While our wisdom traditions will offer us a vision of who we are and who we want to become that might guide our action, de la Torre says, look, we have to look very closely at what the reality is, and engage in some analysis to ask, how did we get to the reality where we're at, right, before we can allow those values and that wisdom to guide us in a way forward. We need to begin our praxis in the observation and analysis stages with a close look at the landscape in which we actually live. Right? So at this point, I hope you have the background to the theory or the framework that I want us to be thinking about. Right? I've proposed a vision of what I think a Christian wisdom for our world might be. And we're using De La Torre to say, well, before we try to work toward that wisdom, we need to have a clear sense of where we are, right, and how we got to the point where we're at in order to really engage in that reflection and action most successfully. So I want to continue this with a handout, and maybe I'll grab a few piles and pass a little break in our discussion here, or our presentation here. Yes, thank you. I'm feeling clumsy too. And holding up those visions, those ancient visions of holding all things in common, the visions of the bishops at Vatican II that all persons would have everything necessary for leading a life truly human. And so I want you to hold those visions in your mind. And then with me consider, over the next few moments, that on nearly every measure of human well-being presented by the bishops at Vatican II in their wisdom, people of color in the United States are disproportionately disadvantaged. And we can use the tools of the social sciences to see this reality clearly. So from out of my work as a Christian theologian and thinking with Christian ethicists, I'm really inspired by the idea that our ancient wisdoms might continue to shape us, that our ancient wisdoms might continue to say to us, look, this is how we should be as human beings. But as I'm thinking about our traditions shaping us, I am increasingly recognizing that I, as a white theologian, cannot simply say, oh, look at how well I'm doing, right? That I have to look at the landscape and really see how much we really are not in this nation, right? Even anywhere near close to what the bishops have articulated, and other Christians have articulated, right, as God's desire for human well-being. To see the landscape of racialized disparity, we might begin with the most basic reality of economic disparity and see what the Pew Research Center reports, that the median wealth of white households in the U.S. is 20 times that of black households and 18 times that of Hispanic households or Latino households. That fact alone, right, should really make us pause and say, how did this happen? Right? How is it that the economic security that provides so much of our food, our clothing, our shelter, right, can have such a dramatic racialized disparity? This economic reality means that while 10% of white children are poor, roughly 27% of black and Latino children are poor, and 40% of American Indian children live in poverty. The social sciences help us to see this clearly. Sociologists can help us to see the projects that continue this racialized disparity in our current moment, when African Americans continue to be discriminated against in the labor market, concentrated in blue-collar employment, and along with Latinos, particularly dark-skinned Latinos, earn the lowest wages. And these are from economic and sociological studies that really says, how do we make sense of this disparity that we see in our world? Economists and sociologists help us to see that the economic security that is a measure of human well-being is, in fact, racialized and has deep structures of racial disparity in our context. So if we're at that point of observation, right, as the social sciences allow us to get out of our individual experience or our local experience, and the social sciences allow us to see with data what we wouldn't otherwise see from an individual point of view, right? And what they show on this question, right, is a very clear racial disparity in wealth. If we're staying with the social scientific tools and the step of observation, so here's just another, each of these slides is representing the same reality and kind of giving us that visual sense of how social scientific data provides a portrait of the world that we live in. So this is just another slide that helps us to see the statistics of that racialized wealth disparity. Staying with the tools of social sciences and this step of observation, we observe also that home ownership disadvantages people of color. When home ownership is the most important source of building wealth and transferring it generationally, it's a problem in our nation that 72% of white Americans own homes, while only 46% of Latino Americans and 42% of Black Americans do. As ethicist Alex Mikulich reminds us, owning a home and housing location are critical to predicting access to quality education, development of personal wealth, employment, health and safety, democratic participation, transportation, and quality childcare. So the disparity of home ownership isn't just about owning a home. It's about the way that the home is a doorway, so to speak, into all sorts of other dimensions of human well-being. The social segregation of white, Black, and Latino neighborhoods in America is an important part of our praxis circle, observing this segregation and understanding its impact on human well-being. Both private economic resources and wealth and homeownership, and the geographic advantage that comes with living in a wealthy neighborhood impact educational opportunities in the United States. Once again, it's the data from the social sciences that helps us to see that a disproportionate number of Black and Latino students are educated in under-resourced primary and secondary schools. Not just in my experience in the Bronx, not just in the experience in Chicago or the experience in Florida, but nationally, this is a pattern and a reality. The Georgetown University report, Separate and Unequal, makes evident also that opportunities for college education, especially at elite private colleges and universities, continues to disproportionately favor white students. This results in disparities in educational attainment that we can see are also racialized. As the executive summary of the Georgetown report indicates, and I quote, "The higher education system is more and more complicit as a passive agent in the systemic reproduction of white racial privilege across generations. Lack of access to education and opportunity has racialized a disparity in employment and in incarceration, conditions which are at odds with the bishop's call for the right to employment, a good reputation, and respect for many of our neighbors of color." So with the tools of the social sciences, with demographics, sociology, and economics, we can see very clearly that our landscape is one of racialized disparity. And as I indicated earlier, I think that's the important dimension of the social sciences, is that they get us out of our narrow experience and they help us to see a bigger reality and a structural reality. And the structural reality that you see on that one side of your handout is that on every measure of a life fully human, articulated by the bishops at Vatican II, people of color are regularly, systematically, and statistically disadvantaged. But Delatorre's method does not simply ask us to see this reality clearly. It requires that we move to the next step of the cycle and engage in some analysis that asks the question, why is this the reality we see in front of us? Here, the social sciences with history, law, and government help us to see more clearly some of the root causes of the disparity we experience today. And as a theologian concerned about how our social visions might become a reality, history, law, and government help me to see how Christian theologies of white Christian supremacy underwrote many of the decisions that have created the disparity that you see in front of you, or that we see in front of us today. So Delatorre's method invites us to ask the question about questions about today's racialized disparity, and to turn to history to understand the generational legacy of a nation that built up its white citizens at the expense of people of color. And history can also help us to see that it was Christian ideologies and theologies that made this injustice appear reasonable. In the origins of this country, in the beginning of the modern period, the ideology of the moral superiority of Christianity was married with an emerging ideology of white supremacy in religio-racial projects that created the disparity we experience today. The founding of this nation was on land stolen from native peoples, with the theological justification that God ordained Christian rule. This was accompanied by interpretive practices that named the inferiority of native wisdoms, since they did not sufficiently cultivate the land as Genesis had demanded. These and other theological reasonings by white Christians were written into law in 1823 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that indigenous nations' right to occupancy was superseded by Christian nations' right to discovery. This law guaranteed that the wealth generation that comes from land ownership would be channeled from out of the hands of indigenous people and into the hands of Christians. A similar logic that God willed the building up of a Christian nation justified the stolen labor of enslavement of African peoples. In this era, the theologic of white and Christian supremacy invoked the curse of Ham, naming dark skin as evidence of the curse that God delivered on pagan peoples. For more than 200 years, Christians in this country theologized the supremacy of white Christian ways and justified the enslavement of black African peoples, reasoning theologically that slavery might bring them to the light of the gospel from out of the paganism of African traditions and what they saw as the heresy of Islam. Right? And so history can show us the way that theology was used to promote white supremacy. With theological reasoning that God desired the success of a white Christian nation, the era of the 19th century saw land and labor extracted from people of color and wealth redistributed to white citizens through legislation like the 1862 Homestead Act, which gave access to land ownership to white citizens from out of the bounty of the vast tracts of land recently taken from native peoples and taken from the United States of Mexico, as our neighbors to the south were known at that time. That same year, and through that same access to land-based wealth, the United States of America guaranteed the higher education of white citizens through profits from the sale of these lands for the establishment of land-grant universities. In this era, although persons from around the globe worked to build up the nation, bringing with them their distinctively sacramental biology and the religious and cultural differences that characterize human diversity, the perception of these racial and religious differences continued to exclude non-white, non-Christian others from access to flourishing in the United States, as evidenced in the exclusion of Chinese immigrants in the late 19th century and the subsequent immigration policy that barred persons from the so-called Asiatic zone. Each of these legislations were made reasonable by Christians who argued that the non-white, non-Christian other couldn't be assimilated into a white Christian nation. So theology has been responsible for the ways that people of color have been dispossessed in each of the eras of American history. The image of white citizens, the empowerment of white citizens continued even after emancipation of the formerly enslaved, when in the early 20th century, systems of Social Security, federal homeownership programs, minimum wage, the Bracero program to support farms, and the infusion of resources for growth of the suburbs were each put in place in a way that secured the well-being of white citizens in education, homeownership, and employment, while not securing those benefits for people of color. These are the key components of generational wealth accumulation: education, homeownership, and employment. And in each era, white Christian theology mobilized its symbolic capital to keep these sites of empowerment in the hands of white people in this country. Even into the mid-20th century, ideologies of white supremacy infected our educational system, blocking the advancement for people of color. Racist practices in the mortgage lending barred access to this governmentally supported project of generational wealth accumulation. Through social scientific analysis, we might trace the economic benefits that were given to white owners of the means of production in land and factories, and how this often included the exploitation of workers. And if we're thinking about the continued means of accessing wealth that sustains human lives in this country, we would also want to pay attention, and the social sciences help us to see this, to the disproportionate number of workers of color today who continue to be paid less than the living wage. The story of our national encounter with religious and racial difference, right, up to this point, takes on a different chapter in 1965. And there were immigration laws that were put in place that opened the U.S. to a much broader range of religious and racial diversity. So since 1965, we've had a much more open possibility for welcoming people from a variety of places around the globe, which has increased our national diversity, our religious and our racial diversity. But we also need to continue to ask how Americans continue to promote the idea of our land as a white Christian nation. The national story that I've presented so far helps us to move along this ethical cycle with some important data, and then return to those elements of a Christian wisdom and ask ourselves how we're doing. Right? The Christian wisdom that I proposed was of living in community, where all persons have their needs met, where racial diversity is a sacramental gift, and religious cooperation is a value. As we're thinking about moving to action from out of this analysis and the observation of our reality, thinking about how our ethical traditions might give us a different vision to move toward, I think it's important for us, as we're thinking about being agents of social change, not only to know the national historical reality, but also to think about how that national story is manifest in our local experience. Our national history, our national history shows a pattern that repeats in local contexts. This national pattern is that white citizens were empowered by legislation, that Native peoples were dispossessed of their land, that Black citizens were dispossessed of labor and discriminated against, and Latinos in America have been exploited and discriminated against as well. This history plays out as a reality in a distinctive way in my institutional home of the Bronx in New York City. And I can see this national history, and I can see the different eras and how that evolved in New York City. It plays out in a different way, but a parallel way, in my home of origin in Chicago. The contours of this history, its ghosts and its scars, are written into the geography of my home of choice in suburban New Jersey. So as I undertake the project of being an agent of social change, guided by the wisdom of my faith tradition, I have to take into account this national pattern, this national history, and ask the question of where it has impacted people in my local reality. So as we move to action, thinking about this discussion tonight and where we might move to action with our panel next time, we might begin to ask the question of how this national history is manifest in your home of Fort Collins, Colorado. I would imagine that you have a much richer sense of this history, but from what I have been able to glean from some of the histories that I have encountered, this national history, right, plays out in its own way in your geographical area. In the crucial period of national expansion, that 19th century period, maps were made to chronicle the transfer of land from indigenous peoples to a Christian nation. Here, the dark gray of Colorado is marked for transfers that took place in the period between 1851 and 1870. So that's the crucial period that we're talking about. And it's in this period that Fort Collins history tells us that Camp Collins was built to protect travelers and settlers along the Colorado branch of the Overland Trail. It was this same year that Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Morrill Land Grant Act, an act that dictated that proceeds from the sale of land in each state would be invested in a perpetual endowment to support colleges of agriculture and mechanic arts. In 1870, Colorado Agricultural College was founded as one of the 68 land-grant universities, which would then become Colorado State University. In 1877, the Colorado Central Railroad arrived, and Fort Collins becomes a thriving agricultural center. But this local lens on our national history helps us to see that this crucial period of building up Fort Collins and many of America's cities came at the cost to Native peoples. Located between Fort Sedgwick and Mill Creek, Fort Collins and Colorado Agricultural College were established in a geographical location and historical period of great contest, as we can see from this map of the so-called Indian battles. And what we see in this is a little bit difficult to see from where you are. What we see in this map is Fort Sedgwick, the Battle of Fort Sedgwick, 1865, and the Battle of Mill Creek in 1879. This sense that the emergence of Fort Collins comes in a time of great contest, that this was not simply the emergence or the sprouting up of a place to live right in the middle of unoccupied land. As I'm thinking about local history, my local history, and the local history here, it occurred to me that perhaps your tragic geographical history and my own intersect when viewed through the lens of our national story. Because in 1877, the former president of Fordham University, my institutional home, published a series on Native Americans in a widely read chronicle. His theological claims of Christian supremacy and his assessment that Native peoples were degraded savages with an inability to lead a settled life certainly could have helped the cause of Native displacement in your part of the country. And so these histories and the theological production that's happening in diverse places in our nation, right, certainly could have shaped a different moral imagination. Right? And so I'm kind of imagining that the production of theological ideas in my part of the nation and what was going on in your part of the nation at that same time could possibly have had some connection. While I can see that the former president of Fordham was producing as knowledge ideas that would help to dispossess Native peoples, we could also look at theologians and historians, sociologists and social scientists, and what they were producing as ideas or knowledge about whiteness and white supremacy, when in the period after 1877 and the arrival of the railroad to Fort Collins was being built up at the same time that African Americans began moving from the South in search of opportunity. When, in our national history, African Americans moved in great waves from the South to opportunities in other parts of the country, why didn't they settle in great numbers in Fort Collins? And when they did settle in Deerfield, Colorado, why didn't they thrive? In 1918, when the African American families of Deerfield began to default on their mortgages and equipment loans, where were other Christians who might hold all things in common? Thinking about our national story again with another episode, and the story of the Mexican migration and the close connections of Mexico and America, I'm curious also about whose flourishing was in view when the sugar beet industry capitalized on the tight economic connections and national policies that entwined Mexico and the U.S. As Barbara Hawthorne reports, the company's concern was to secure for the farmers and factories such a supply of cheap labor as would encourage more farmers to raise sugar beets at their contract price. And the final episode in the post-1965 era, like many university towns, Fort Collins experienced an increase in religio-racial diversity from the 1960s on. And the question that might be raised in this last chapter is, how has the community expanded to work together across religious lines? The racialized economic disparity and religious intolerance we experience today not only remind us of how far we must go to ensure the full flourishing of all humanity, as held up in the Christian wisdom, it also reminds us of the historical and human choices to thwart human flourishing that have taken place in this country under ideologies of white Christian supremacy. And so we might ask, how are we doing? Oops. In 2014, Time magazine reported, and I quote, that the good people of Fort Collins, Colorado are the most satisfied with their city. Among a handful of cities named by Money Magazine as best places to retire, Fort Collins is described as a place where educational opportunities, outdoor activities, cultural amenities, and good medical care are near at hand. It's not surprising that Fort Collins was named #1 best place to live by Money Magazine in 2006. Our wisdom traditions and the observation and analysis we've just undertaken might unsettle us just a bit. Indeed, our wisdom traditions aim at the flourishing of all, and this requires that we view this reality through a particular lens. How are we living in community where everyone's needs are met, where racial diversity is a sacramental gift and religious cooperation is valued? At this point, we might be reminded of the importance of homeownership, and we might view this element of homeownership through the lens of racial justice and human well-being. And I'm quoting Alex Mikulich again because I think that his vision of the importance of homeownership from a Christian ethical perspective is really quite compelling. As Mikulich recounts, racial disparities are rooted in at least a century of deliberate governmental and business policies that created housing and educational segregation. Housing segregation is a structural linchpin, he writes, of economic and racial inequality. Owning a home and housing location are critical to predicting access to quality education, development of personal wealth, employment, health and safety, democratic participation, transportation, and quality childcare. So to ask how we're doing toward a thriving community of well-being, we need to see clearly the history and the reality of racial and economic disparity as we think about the makeup of our communities. And so I just have one more set of slides here and then one more theological point. One more set of slides in thinking about the various dimensions of what makes up a thriving community. And if we're looking through the lens of race in this country and thinking about the racial dynamic or the racial range that we have in this country, we have 63% of a white population in this country. And if we look, I know you can't see all that well, but the visual, that the 63% here becomes 83% in Fort Collins. And we can think about the historical realities of that, right? But we also can think about the economic realities of that, right? So this is just, I put these, the data that the social sciences help us to see. I've just put the data in 2 columns. Right, so that nationally, we have a white population in America of about 63%, and Fort Collins around 82 or 83%. Our African American or black population nationally is 13%, and Fort Collins is 1.3%, and our Latino population is 17% nationwide and around 10% here in Fort Collins. The piece of thinking about economic disparity and opportunities, right, to become part of communities is very important, right? So if we have the median household income in Fort Collins was listed at 53, somewhere around 54,000, which puts it right in the range of white households in the country, but puts it quite a bit above black and Latino households in this country. So just thinking about how is it that economic disparity, right, also intersects with the opportunities for creating a racially diverse and multicultural community. So we have a vision, in closing here, of living in community where needs are met, where racial diversity is a sacramental gift, and interreligious cooperation is valued. From out of our observation and analysis, we might see clearly that our national realities fall short of the kingdom of God that the Christian wisdom tradition strives after. As the anti-racism materials of the Presbyterian Church USA proposes, Jesus' vision offers a corrective to the world our nation has created. And they publish in their materials is the vision that Jesus gathered a community of people around him that crossed every social and cultural boundary. Those who had been set apart were brought together. Poor and rich, male and female, Gentile and Jew, centurion and tax collector, Canaanite, Galilean, and Syrophoenician. Jesus called this community together in anticipation of and participation in the coming of the new creation. The witness to Jesus gave rise to the ancient wisdom in the Acts of the Apostles, where all things were held in common and no one was in need. The witness to Jesus gave rise to the statement of the bishops at Vatican II that our societies must ensure that all persons have what is necessary for a life truly human. The vision from the Presbyterian Church USA is of Jesus calling a community together in anticipation of and participation in the coming of a new creation that is envisioned not just as some other worldly reality, but the transformation of the world that we actually live in. With them, I would propose that the Christian tradition has asked Christians to craft the world according to their wisdom tradition, to enact what some have called an integral salvation for the flourishing of the whole person and all people in this world and in the world to come. A final theological thought might close our consideration and open our discussion. Christian wisdom centers itself not only on the ancient community Jesus called around him, it is centered also on an eschatological vision of God's intention made complete in the end times of our existence. In the kingdom of God that Jesus preached, all are welcome, all are made whole, all are gathered as one community. And that's the eschatological vision that we hope for and we work toward in the kingdom of God. This kingdom of God is fundamentally rooted in the affirmation that the one God is creator of all and intends in this creation the flourishing of all flesh. Christian wisdom insists that there is one God who created all of humanity in all of our diversity. If our nation and our neighborhood is crafted as a world that is monoracial and mono-religious, we are entirely unprepared for the kingdom to come, when God calls all God's creation back to God's self in completion. So how do we craft the world our wisdom imagines? A world where all flourish, where we live in community, where our needs are met, where racial diversity is a sacramental gift and religious cooperation valued. The social sciences might help us to see how we got here, and they might offer us some ways for us to move forward toward that world our wisdom imagines. Like those earliest Christians, we might ask ourselves again, is this the best that we and God can do together? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannine. Well, I think that in the context of this time that we have shared with Jeannine, much has been given to us to think about, but I'd like, before we go into a discussion period and a question and answer period, for everybody to take just a moment and kind of gather their thoughts and try to focus on one particular bit of information or insight that Jeannine shared with us that really struck you. Take just a moment to do that. Then I'd like to have you share that with the person that's sitting next to you. A new insight or a question or a challenge that hits you quite dramatically for what she has just shared with us. We'll just take about a minute to do this. Doesn't have to be a thesis.
Because if matriarchal means egalitarian, and I just don't know that every matriarchal construct is egalitarian, but if we had a more egalitarian notion and a less individualized notion, there's a fundamental logic here of individualism and self-protection and also a hierarchy. Right? And so the fundamental difference, if in fact a matriarchal culture includes egalitarian, then it would disrupt the hierarchy. One of the things that is behind some of this is what a sociologist, Joe Fagan, calls the white racial frame. And the white racial frame he describes as God, right, at the top of this pyramid, Christ, Christians, and white Europeans, right, in this pyramid. That's the same patriarchal pyramid that feminist theologians will say, well, that's the problem, is thinking about our humanity in a hierarchical way. So if matriarchal means egalitarian, then your fundamental hierarchy has been dismantled. It's an excellent question. My background has been in issues of religious diversity and feminist theology, and so now I'm kind of bridging to think about how racial diversity adds to our theological thinking. But I haven't done all of these, haven't brought them all together really in a integrated way yet. I was asked this same question when I presented some of this work among a group of theologians. This same question, so I know it's a good. I know that this is the next question. And the example that I gave was of an African American woman in 1893. Fannie Barrier Williams is speaking at the World's Parliament of Religions. And she's speaking about, I think the title of her talk was something about what Christianity can do for, at that point, the Negro was the way that she phrased it. And she called her audience, right, to witness the history, right, and to no longer just have these ideas of, love and brotherhood, what have you. And she said, I want you to hear clearly, I want you to hold in your mind, right, the fact that women on the auction block saw their children sold so in order to make money to send missionaries to foreign lands. That's Christian supremacy, that's white supremacy, and that's a patriarchal structure that's right? So there is a connection there. There is a connection there, and that'll be my next project.
Then if that follows, it would seem like the patriarchal system in Christian religions is going to have to dismantle.
I would be for that. I mean, the feminist theologians that I am compelled by, really, so Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza, the vision that what we see in the New Testament is Jesus constructing a discipleship of equals, right? Yes, that's what, that to me would, and so there's another piece of my work that I've developed in relation to this, and it has to do with Christian love, right? And this discipleship of equals from out of the New Testament, right? That Jesus, the circle of love keeps extending and extending and extending out, right? So you could have a discipleship of equals that still had Christian supremacy, but you can look in the New Testament and you can see strands that say, no, not so much just a religious exclusivism, right? A love of the other, love of neighbor, love of enemy, right? That the concentric circles of this discipleship of equals is supposed to expand infinitely, right? And so I think that there is a fundamental grounding logic, right, that is either hierarchy, right, or it's egalitarian, and this fits perfectly, right? The idea of white supremacy fits perfectly in a hierarchy. Right? And so how do you dismantle that hierarchy? Great question.
Thank you for your very thoughtful challenge. My simple question is, where do we go from here?
That's right.
I'll look forward to ideas from the group.
Yeah, I think that's so the place I realize that I'm at is that this history history was unknown to me, right? I could be a perfectly good Christian and a perfectly good Christian theologian and never once say anything about racialized disparity in the world that I live in. And I would still be considered a perfectly good white Christian theologian, right? No one would ever say, how can you speak about Christian love when we're living in a world like this? Okay, so the place where I think we're at right now, and others may have a sense of where you think we're at, the place I think we're at right now is that Christian communities and white Christian congregations are inviting themselves to learn this history and to wrestle with it, right? So the UCC church just put out that you can either do it in a 6-week installment or you can do it in a 6-month installment that unpacks these same sorts of ideas, the history of white supremacy, I don't know, they name it in some places there, the reality of racism as it still continues to impact people of color, the structural disparities, right? So I think the first moment, and the moment that I've taken up is, let's have a sense of this history, right? As a theologian, as a Christian, I want to see where did Christian theologies, right? Where did it inform this legislation and these realities? Because then I want to say, not only do I think this reality is a terrible history, but that I bear some responsibility for that because of the way theological production shapes the way we see the world. So the first step is, right, do we know this history? Do we see our responsibility with respect to this history? And then the social sciences are going to help us to say, okay, what can we do? And they're doing that work, right? How do we vote, right? How do we think about how our resources are shared in our local communities? How are our schools educating students, white students and students of color? Do we see in this community what we see in so many other communities, that racialized disparity continues in our educational system? Right, so we need to have the history, we need to ask those questions, and then we need to say, okay, what could we do differently? Right? What could we do differently? How can we make different sets of choices that empower people of color in this country? One of the things that I hope you see in this presentation, and that the legislative dimension helps us to see clearly, is that this country created opportunities and infused resources to white well-being that it simply didn't to people of color, right? And so when we're thinking about, the idea of reparations, the idea that we need to do something different, right, to make up for the deficit that we've given to people of color in this country. There's a whole lot of white people that I know and white Christians that I know who say, oh, well, you know, I pulled my family, right, we worked hard, we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? Why should I be giving them a handout? It's like, well, the mortgage lending system, right, was infused from the federal government and gave opportunities for white families. The educational system was a governmental program that gave resources to it. The land grant, universities and the Homestead Act, right? So that it's not that we're suddenly giving them, right, to people who it's not like we haven't already infused resources, right, to some populations in this country in our history. So yeah, there's all kinds of things that we can do. I don't have any single one that is the answer.
So I'm stuck somewhat in the analysis phase because we can point out all these things against Asians.
That's right.
Chinese, Japanese, Muslim today, right? They're almost all Asian, and yet they do seem to be doing so much better.
So there's two elements that I want us to think with. There are sociological studies that ask the question of whether our racial ideologies, right, haven't assessed what it is to be Asian in a way that gives a more positive, right, interpersonal response, right? So there are sociological studies that ask precisely that question, and they talk about how attitudes within the U.S., right, that there might be different interpersonal interactions, right? But honestly, my theory, and I'm not a sociologist, so I haven't been able to really pin this down in a specific study. The U.S. excluded Asians from becoming citizens, right, all the way up into the 20th century, right? So, up till that point, Asians were excluded. And our immigration policies prior to 1965 were immigrants building up the country, right? So people to work in industry, people to work on the railroads, right? Following that, right? Not skilled workers, not people coming from other countries bringing their resources with them. Does anyone know how the legislation is written in 65? Our immigration legislation in 1965 prioritizes the reunification of families and professionals. So who's coming post-1965? When do large populations of Asians come to this country, right? If they were excluded prior to the 20th century, and now we've changed our legislation for who can come, many post-1965 are bringing different sets of resources. So I think that knowing the immigration laws, right, gives us a different frame to say, oh, it's not that Asians were able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? It's that we were allowing people with different sets of skills and resources to come into the country. So that's my hypothesis.
I guess I'd be careful there though, because also a lot of the asylum folks are coming in that are Asian descent, and it doesn't explain the Japanese very well.
And that's where the social sciences, right? We need all of the tools of the social sciences to say, so this is why I said, this is my hypothesis,
Yeah.
right? I'm not a social scientist. But the fact that prior to 1965, we are barring immigration from so many Asian countries. I think that is an important thing. So if there's a sociologist among us who can write that report for me, that would be very helpful. Thank you for your question.
I look at this and wonder, what's happening within that white population in terms of stratification? And if in fact, we won't end up in, to some extent, classifications with numbers very similar to the blacks, the Latinos, and so forth.
So in our current moment.
Could you repeat the question?
When I look at the white population and the economic numbers, my sense is that with what's going on in our political system today, we will see the white, if you take the white and look at our stratification of social and economic issues, we'll have groups that fall right in with the blacks, the Latinos, and so forth.
Yes,
So to lump all whites
That's right.
together
That's right.
is not.
Right, so that's right. So statistically, right, we can see, let me get to one of these, sorry to fly through these. Statistically, we can see, with the tools of the social sciences, we can see the disparity, right, the racialized disparity in our country. Additional sociological tools, economics, thinking about the various demographics. Additional sociological tools would ask us to think about this, the white population. And I don't have, I'm not even sure I know which element to, kind of how to formulate a response. The response I have is maybe not to the question that you're asking. So let me give you a response for now. Are we seeing a continued pattern of a resurgence of white supremacy precisely because white members of this population are feeling that threat, right? That economic threat. And so the response of white supremacy is a response that says, look, my well-being is threatened, right? So we need to target people of color. We need to target immigrants, right, in order to protect my well-being. I'm not sure. I think that your question might have been formulated a little bit differently, so I'm not sure I'm quite getting at it. But I think that that's really the crucial, that's the crucial question right, to see both that statistically, right, the median wealth for white families continues to be this dramatic difference, and, right, there's a reality of white poverty as well. Right? But that statistic of the children, I think, is one of the most helpful. That even though we have roughly the same numbers of white, black, and Latino numbers, right, real numbers of white, black, and Latino children in poverty, the percentage of what number of the population they are is very different, right? So same numbers. So yes, we have white families, white children, white people in poverty. Right, but the percentage of how many families, people of color, are far higher. Does that make sense? But a great question, and an important one for us to think through, right? How this dynamic is shifting and evolving. And I'd ask us to pay attention, right? If we have an evolving landscape, how do we pay attention to what the sociologists call they call it our racial project. Right? So they try to describe, Howard Wynant and Michael Omi are these two sociologists who talk about America having a series of racial projects. Right? The material conditions change and different language and ideas about race, right, then circulate in our public sphere. So with this reality, the economic reality that we're experiencing today, are we hearing, right, different tones in the racial project that we experience in our communities? Does that right? So thinking about, yes, we have a dynamic and shifting material conditions, right? What are the ideas about race and about white supremacy or Christian supremacy that function in our new context?
We have one more question here on this side, then I'll take the gentleman in the front and perhaps one more. Go ahead, Christine.
I really have a lot of I really have a lot of gratitude for sense making from the multiple disciplines. I think it's wonderful. And to comment on what John had said before about Asians. So in the analysis stage, while he was saying that, I thought to myself, why? Why did that happen? And I wonder if it's because at one point in our history, African Americans were not even considered a whole person. They were considered 3/5 of a person or 4/5 of a person. And Native Americans were referred to as savages. And so that could be something that, as we look at this from multi-disciplines, to continue to say why, and try to make sense out of how that's happened. She's actually an epidemiologist, Camara Phyllis Jones, and she talks about racial disparities in health. And she provides a framework that I think speaks to some of what you're returning us to, where she asks us to think about racism as interpersonal, right? The ideologies that frame interpersonal encounters. She asks us to think about racism as internalized, right? So ideas of superiority or inferiority. And she asks us to think about racism as structural, right? So my question about, or my answer about citizenship was a structural answer, whereas the question of what is our mental framing as we encounter people of other racial groups, right, I think speaks to what you're saying there.
And then we'll take one more question on this side in the back. Go ahead.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, it is on. Yeah.
My name is Steele James Westfall from Walton, Colorado. I've been homeless the last 4 months, and I don't know why the Lord called me here tonight. But I have a lot of ethnical, diverse friends. I got a Christian Indian, and I got a mischief Indian. I got a Christian black man and a mischief black man. I got a Christian Hispanic and a mischief Hispanic. I see a lot of diversity all over the board.
Use the microphone, please. What you have to say is important. But we tend not all hear you.
Put it really close to your mouth.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Go.
All right. I'm not the average homeless man. I used to work for KLX up there in North Dakota. B Aerospace is who I applied for, looking for logistics there. Just running oil field tools out the oil field as a hot shop. I graduated from LCT as an ASC Master Certified Diesel and Truck Technician. A while back, Heavenly Father, Christ Jesus, came and found me. Holy Ghost was in my bedroom. I was dug in like a tick. I have one amazing testimony. But when I find myself here tonight, I see that in order to solve these problems that you're looking at, we have to bring the religious community together first. In Proverbs, it talks about how a fool will describe, he thinks that he's wiser than 7 wise men. There's nothing you can do with that. And you talk about the ethnicity and the diversity there, but unless we turn and become as small children, we shall never see the kingdom of heaven. Relate this to Scripture. You ask a 4-year-old black kid the difference between him and his little white friend, he's not able to tell you. He can't see it. When I'm with Sarah Rivera, my Mexican buddy, there ain't no difference. When I'm at the homeless shelter, and we got this circle over here, all brown. This circle over here, all black. Every one of them have these hate wars, their own idols. The Bible speaks a lot about idols. Knowledge and wisdom cannot reach them unless we pray to Heavenly Father to open their perspective. Only Heavenly Father can do this. As they are now, Heavenly Father has given their minds up to an alternative perspective. That comes through prayer. I could help you guys pray for them now. That's just page 10. We all know this. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Thank you for leading us in prayer. And Jeannine, would you like to respond? Because you alluded to some of this in your early comments.
I
That
really
affirm completely what you're saying.
I really appreciate bringing us back into the depth that our wisdom traditions might have. So this question of what do we do, right? And for people who are grounded in wisdom traditions, we should be looking to our wisdom traditions to give us visions that we can work toward. The Our Father that you close us with, right? We, whoever we are here, right? Christians say that over and over and over, but do they pause, right? Do they really say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those, right? Do they really care? Give us this day. And who's the us in this day, our daily bread, right? So there's so much that we could rest with within our wisdom traditions. So one of the questions is, right, how do we rest with our religious traditions and allow, through the lens of the racial disparity that we experience, and the experience of people not having what they need, right? So the panel next week is, or not next week, the next time that the panel meets, ask the question, right? How might we think about creating spaces where people do have what they need in food, clothing, and shelter, right? What does that look like? I started my talk with what I find compelling in the wisdom vision in Acts of the Apostles, right? Where the believers are all of one heart and soul, and they hold all things in common, right? So how do we raise up that vision and ask ourselves the question, to what extent am I hoarding what I have, and to what extent am I guided by a faith tradition that invites me to do more with it?
Jeannine, thank you very much for those comments. I had told her prior to our conversation now that we were going to close with a prayer, and I was going to ask you to take the thoughts of her talk that struck you and ask for blessing that God, the Great Spirit, power of wisdom would bring blessing to our efforts to make a difference. I think you have encouraged us in your comments to do that very thing. And so I would like to just pause and close this part of the evening with that moment of quiet, where we each commit ourselves to doing something about what we have heard tonight in the spirit of your question earlier. So let's just take that moment. With us tonight, I thank you for joining us in this conversation, and I remind you that the second part of our conversation gets very specific about issues of homelessness, issues of families looking for homes, and also various other types of diversity issues on racial and financial levels can be addressed in the panel of people from our community. We will be giving those flyers out as you leave, and I think Denise has a few more comments to make.
And before we hand it over to Denise, can I just draw your attention to the remarkable range of books that are in the back, on the back tables there, that really are additional resources for some of the elements that I talked about tonight. And David said he'd be happy if you would borrow those books and read them and return them and talk about them.
Thank you, Jeannine, for a wonderful talk. When her new book comes out in August, I will post it on the front page of the website so that you can have access to it. I want to thank everyone here for coming, because we can't do this without the community and the discussion and everyone's heart. I would also like to thank David and First United Methodist. They're always so gracious in sharing their space with us. We couldn't make this happen without them either. We have a couple other quick things. We wanted to thank Suzanne Birkenschindler, who served on our board, and her husband Lee is here, who also, I don't know if you guys have seen some of the beautiful posters around town. Lee is our volunteer graphic artist who makes those for us. We have surveys outside. We always like input. Some of you have heard about the Joachim Viens Memorial Lecture Series we'll be doing next year. There are flyers outside on the table for that as well. Our last discussion of the year will be on April 20th. It's going to be a panel. It'll be here at First United. It's called Are We Crafting the Communities Our Wisdom Traditions Imagine? Flyers again outside. And on the 20th, if you want to come early at 6 o'clock, we are going to be demoing our new website. We'll have some computers if people want to see what that looks like and how to get through it. Two other quick things. One, if you miss any of our talks, all of the videos are posted on our website. So tirprogram.com, so if you don't live close or you can't make it to an evening, you can just go to the front page, and on the top line there's a bar that says videos, and just click on that and you can scroll down and pick what you want. And lastly, sorry, I just wanted to announce that we lost Jim Cox last week, beloved member of our TAR community, and his funeral will be this Tuesday, the 11th, at 11 o'clock at Timberline, yes. Timberline, the big church that's on Timberline the Drain. So again, that's 11 o'clock on the 11th for Jim Cox. Thank you. Have a good evening.